Hello and welcome to the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. My name is Claudia Rizzini. I'm the Executive Director of the Fellowship Program. The Institute is one of the world's leading centers for interdisciplinary exploration. We bring students, scholars, artists, and practitioners together to pursue curiosity-driven research, expand human understanding, and grapple with questions that demand insights from across disciplines. You can be a part of this vibrant community by attending public programs such as this one, visiting virtual exhibitions, or pursuing the special collections held at the Schlesinger Library. To learn more, you can visit radcliffe.harvard.edu and sign up to receive more information on news and events. We'll begin the program with a presentation by Amelia Glaser. After the presentation, the speaker will respond to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time throughout the program. We ask that you keep your questions brief to allow us to address as many as possible in the time that we have together. It is my pleasure to introduce Rita E. Hauser Fellow Amelia M. Glaser. Professor Glaser is an associate professor of Russian and comparative literature at the University of California, San Diego, where she also holds an endowed chair in Judaic studies. Professor Glaser has written an extraordinary range of scholarly and critical studies of Russian, Yiddish, and Ukrainian literature. Her scholarly work is in both Jewish and Slavic studies, centers on literary cultural interactions between coexisting and sometimes adversarial communities. From conflicting Russian, Jewish, and Ukrainian literary portrayals of 17th century Cossack uprising to Yiddish modernist poets who voice solidarity with Palestinian Arabs. Professor Glaser has published extensively on a variety of subjects. Most recently, she is the author of Song in Dark Times, Yiddish Poetry of Struggle from Scottsboro to Palestine. Professor Glaser examines a generation of Jewish leftist poets who extended themselves in Yiddish verse to other oppressed people of the globe, Palestinian Arabs, African Americans, and Spanish Republicans. The book argues that the long 1930s gave rise to a genre of internationalist modernism in which ideas of national collective memory were rewritten as the shared experiences of many national groups. She's also the author of Jews and Ukrainians in Russia's Literary Borderlands and is the editor of Komitan Aesthetics, Stories of Khmelnytsky, Competing Literature Legacy of the 1648 Ukrainian Cossack Uprising, and Prolet Pen, America's Rebel Yiddish Poets. At Radcliffe, Professor Glaser is at work on a new book project exploring artistic performances and literature narratives about the history and future of Ukraine since the 2014 Maidan protests. As many in Ukraine have started to re-envision Ukrainian identity, others, both in and outside the country, have asserted Ukraine as an ethnocentric nation-state. Thus, Ukraine has become a platform for concern over democracy, the freedom of press, tradition, and ethnic heritage. The book will reflect how historical narratives about Ukraine are reconsidered within a post-Soviet discourse about identity and nationhood. Professor Glaser hopes to address whether it is possible to adjust and imagine identity to acclimate changing conceptions of community and citizenship. Professor Glaser is an award-winning translator and has written for the New York Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Jewish Quarterly, and the Times Literary Supplement. She received her PhD in comparative literature from Stanford University. And now it is my pleasure to give the floor to Amelia Glaser.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for that introduction. Well, it's really an honor to be here at the Radcliffe Institute this year. I'm inspired by an accomplished group of artists and scholars that I've started to get to know. My most recent book came out in the middle of a pandemic. The research for it was actually done cloistered in a combination of sabbatical and maternity leave. So it's a particular pleasure to emerge from isolation to work on a new project here. Here on the slide in front of you next to Radcliffe, you see a picture of my home institution, UC San Diego. This is the library. And I want to thank my colleagues in the UCSD Literature Department who have been incredibly supportive of my work. I also want to give a shout out to 3 grad students in particular who served as research assistants at various points on the work that I'm going to be presenting today: Julia Fermented-Seisler, Xiaozhao Wang, and Eveline Vasquez. I also want to thank my 4 Radcliffe research partners, Paige Lee, Olga Kian, James Quillen, and Polina Galouchka, who are working with me here. My work means very little if it doesn't speak directly to my students, and I'm pleased that because of this Zoom format, some of my grad students can be here today. So as Claudia mentioned, my work in comparative literature focuses on the intersection between Jewish literature and Slavic literature, both before and after the Bolshevik Revolution. I'm interested in particular in the stories that communities tell about one another. And my newest book, which I'm going to be talking about today, came out this year, focuses on Jewish writers who wrote about other groups' struggles, about the Spanish Civil War, Jim Crow, the frustrations of Palestinian Arabs, and Ukrainian peasants, to name a few. I'm going to use my time today to tell a story about this generation of left-wing poets who were writing in Yiddish. And Yiddish, for those who are unfamiliar with the language, is the Germanic language that was spoken in Jewish communities in Europe for about 1,000 years leading up to World War II. But I'm just talking about the long 1930s. At this very polarizing moment, these party-aligned writers were trying to change the meaning of group identity. They were choosing to make others' struggles their own. And I argue that they did this through the use of what I call Jewish passwords. Passwords are terms that were specific to Jewish practice and collective memory. And they applied these passwords to the contemporaneous struggles of non-Jewish minorities. So my goal today is to share this group of poets' bold and sometimes naive attempts to translate other groups' utterly untranslatable pain using terms and memories that were familiar to their readers. And my hope is that the framework that I've developed for discussing this use of poetic passwords may be applicable to other groups of writers. Well, every project has an origin story, and I first encountered these writers as a master's student 20 years ago in Oxford when I was studying Yiddish and I was beginning to translate. I was in the midst of a translation project where I was rendering the Yiddish American communist poets into English. And in the process, I got to know their hopes and dreams. I also got to know their flaws. I took a different turn in my dissertation. I wrote about Ukraine in the 19th century, but these writers remained an enigma to me and they remained with me. So I returned to them for my second monograph. I want to just introduce you to a couple of the writers on this page. I'll be sharing poetry by all of them, but just to give you a sense of who they were. Aaron Kurtz, whose picture you see here on the top right, was born into a Lubavitcher Hasidic family in Eastern Europe. He ran away from home to join the circus. He actually became a circus hairdresser, both for circuses and traveling troops. He eventually found his way to the United States, where he joined the Communist Party. He became the president of the American Proletarian Writers Association. And his personality in particular has always been an enigma to me. His poems of tolerance and social justice belie his rigid adherence to the party line. He wrote a happy birthday poem to Stalin in 1949, a time when rumors about the imprisonment of the leading Soviet Yiddish writers were already circulating as far as the United States. Another poet that I wanted to just, by way of example, introduce is Malka Lee, who's right here in the middle on the bottom. Malka Lee also came from a Hasidic Jewish family. She ended up leaving home because she wanted to become a writer. She left for the United States on her own at the age of 17, worked in sweatshops and studied at a teacher's college at night. She ended up becoming a poet and together with her husband, also a poet, ran an inn in High Falls, New York. She learned only after the war that her entire family had died in the Holocaust. And much of her post-war writing is about this loss. So the book that I wrote is my attempt to make sense of poets like Kurtz and Lee, who put their faith in a liberating world revolution at a time of rising nationalist movements. Well, Macaulay was not the only poet to shift to Holocaust themes after the war. In fact, most of the Yiddish poets that I write about turned inward by the war, if not before, and started to write on more insular Jewish themes by the 1940s. So the period that I'm describing, I call it the age of communist internationalism, begins with Stalin's consolidation of his power in the late 1920s. And it ends with his disintegration of the Comintern, the Communist International, in 1943. But in the early 20th century as well, Jewish modernism had focused on anti-Jewish grassroots violence known as pogroms. The classic example is the poem that you see an excerpt of before you. This is Bialik's Be'ira Harego. This is a poem about the 1903 Kishinev pogrom in what is now Moldova. And Bialik, who was then a young writer, traveled to Kishinev right after this pogrom, this horrific pogrom. 49 people were killed. It was the first pogrom in 20 years in the Tsarist Empire, and the death toll was enormous compared to what had been seen in the 1880s. And he ended up reporting on this pogrom with a poem. It was a kind of grotesque form of reportage. So the poem, I'm just going to read the beginning in this iconic translation by A.M. Klein, the translation that you sometimes will hear in liturgy and synagogue services. Arise and go now to the city of slaughter. Into its courtyards wind thy way. There with thine own hand touch, and with the eyes of thine head, behold on tree, on stone, on fence, on mural clay, the spattered blood and dried brains of the dead. I'll just read the very beginning of the Hebrew. Kum lech lecho le'ira harego uvoso el hachatzeres. He would have pronounced this in Ashkenazi pronunciation, and I thank my colleague David Katz for his help with the Ashkenazi transliteration. So Chaim Nachman Bialik wrote this poem, and simultaneously, he's exalting the human victims to the level of liturgy. He's undermining Jewish prayer through graphic descriptions of dead bodies, and he's giving birth to a modernist Jewish national poetic tradition. The literary critic Don Miron has called the narrator of this poem at times half demented. The Hebrew critic Joseph Klausner called the poem a greater achievement than Ecclesiastes. So Jewish literary modernism arose around this sense of national catastrophe, but also around national solidarity. And in this sense, it's similar to other European modernisms. As Pericles Lewis has shown, many modernisms arose from this idea of national solidarity. In fact, the final line of this poem, in the final line of the poem, Bialik tells his reader to flee Eastern Europe for the desert. Well, if modernists like Bialik were creating new poetic images around pogroms, a quarter of a century later, party-aligned internationalist poets started to develop a new outgrowth of that modernist genre. They were using many of the same images and devices, but they were applying these images and passwords to other groups. So this is a poem by Moshe Taif, written in Minsk, where Taif lived in 1929. It's a poem condemning Zionism, and yet he cites Bialik throughout the poem. So I'll read this just in the English. Woe to the holy home, a city of slaughter. Woe to the holy resting places, a bloody sacrificial altar. No one has anointed you. You are uninvited guests. Why have you stolen the blue and white colors from our honest sky? No, even the 10th generation will not wash away the innocent blood you've spilled here. And you'll notice the second line of the poem, a city of slaughter, which he repeats throughout this long poem, is in Yiddish in Schrittestadt, which is the Yiddish title of Bialik's poem, which he translated himself. So the message of Bialik's of Taif's poem is the opposite of Bialik's. Bialik provides a paratext to cite Jeanette. He's asking, Taif is asking his readers to translate their outrage at pogrom violence, which they will remember from Bialik's poem, to the plight of the Palestinian Arabs who were losing their land. A little bit more context is needed, however, for this poem. The poem appeared in the American Communist Daily Freiheit following a week of violence in Palestine in late August of 1929. And this violence left about 200 Jews and about 200 Arabs dead. The Israeli historian Hillel Cohen has called this year zero of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The violence broke out with a fight in Jerusalem, but it led to the killing of a number of Jews in Hebron, and then a brutal retaliation by primarily British, but also Jewish men in uniform. The Communist International, the Comintern, first condemned the violence as anti-Jewish. They called this a pogrom. But later, they changed their minds about it and called it an uprising. And the aftermath of these events absolutely divided the Jewish left. It prompted many of those who formerly wrote in the left-wing Jewish newspapers to leave, and those who remained with the party were inspired to write more poems in solidarity with the Arab uprising. I don't have the space to talk today at length about the rift that ensued in the Yiddish literary community, but what I find really striking is that those who sided with the Arab masses used Jewish terms for their identification. They used passwords that were drawn, in this case, directly from a Jewish pogrom poem. So whereas modernists like Bialik wrote about Jewish collective trauma, communist internationalists were often using the very same vocabulary to write about non-Jewish ethnic or religious minorities. Now, I don't want to confuse writing about others with altruism. Moshe Taif, who was living in the USSR, had as many personal incentives for writing on behalf of a Palestinian uprising as his opponents had for writing on behalf of the Jews. And in fact, some of the internationalist literature that I consider comes off as very patronizing, grandstanding, or even appropriative. I feel that in order to admire what these writers were doing, I as a reader also need to acknowledge this. But what I want to attempt to convince you of today is the following, and I've provided for you a little roadmap of the talk. First of all, the internationalist poets, the Yiddish internationalists, were using a vocabulary derived from Jewish collective memory to describe the pain of others. And second, the motives notwithstanding, they used poetic passwords drawn from Jewish practice as a way of translating or translocating, as I put it in the book, collective struggles across groups. These are untranslatables. These passwords are kind of untranslatables that rather than barring passage, force passage from one context into another. And I've listed here the different kinds of passwords that I want to cover, time permitting, today. We've already discussed Taif and Taif's use of the pogrom poem as a password for his poem about Palestine. But a few other examples that I'll provide are passwords that draw from rabbinic or liturgical sources, party shibboleths, Christological passwords, passwords that are imported from other contexts, and finally, passwords that can be used as a Trojan horse for talking about Jewish culture. My goal today is to introduce you to this concept of the poetic password that I developed in my last book about Yiddish internationalist poets. But as a kind of sidebar comment, this year at the Radcliffe Institute, I'm applying a very similar framework to understand the work of a very different group of writers and artists. And this newer book, as Claudia mentioned, centers on contemporary Ukrainian writers who are working on integrating the traumatic history of Ukraine's many minority groups into Ukrainian collective memory. So at the end of this talk, I'm going to turn to how I believe the conceptual framework that I established in my work on these Jewish poets might provide a usable model for probing the challenges of talking across collective memory, even in the 21st century. So I want to turn now to a password that's drawn from a rabbinic source. And this is an example that is relevant to Boston's own traumatic and painful history. This is a poem by H. Leivik, written in August of 1928. Leivik was not as devout a communist as Taif was. In fact, he was one of the poets that left the party newspapers in 1929 over the same uprisings in Palestine that TAFE had welcomed. But Leivik was very much aligned with the party newspapers throughout the 1920s. And in fact, he had impeccable revolutionary credentials. He was arrested under the Tsar for his revolutionary activity, exiled to Siberia, and then managed to escape. He made a dramatic escape from Siberia to the United States, where he ended up making ends meet, sometimes barely making ends meet, as a wallpaper hanger in New York, while also becoming one of the most respected Yiddish poets of his generation. I'll read this poem in English and then also in Yiddish just to get a sense of the language in your ear. This is, I'll note, a Yahrzeit poem. It's a poem commemorating the year-death anniversary, in this case of Sacco and Vanzetti, the Italian-American anarchists who were executed in Boston for suspected murder. Today, like last year, the hangman's feet dance the Charleston the world over. Fuller's bite hasn't even been covered with a scab. The same evil from accuser to accuser, the same fist, the same power. Oh, we won't forget how the clock hands dripped with blood that August night. And now in Yiddish, Heint azoi wie fare Joren Charleston en iber der dem Taliensfies. Es ist noch a viele nicht verzeugen geworden, mit kein Heitel der fullerischer Bies. Derselbe Schlacht von Kateger zu Kateger, derselbe Fäust, dieselbe Macht. Wir vergessen nicht die Weisels von Segel, wie sie haben getrifft mit Blut in August Nacht. So Leivik here identifies the perpetrator of this evil as the same evil from accuser to accuser, derselbe Schlacht von Kateger zu Kateger. Sacco and Vanzetti's accusers, their Katego, were the unjust US courts of law, as well as the Massachusetts government, Alvin Fuller. For Leivik, like for many Yiddish poets of his generation, the evil that oppressed Jews in Europe and that oppressed the anarchist immigrants in the United States was the same one. Leivik's poem calls upon fellow Jewish immigrants to fight the cycle of injustice that was perpetuated against innocent victims. And this katego, and this of course is the key password in this poem, would have stood out for readers. This is the classical rabbinic term used for a prosecutor, but a katego in Yiddish had come to mean a prosecuting angel who delivers a kind of heavenly verdict. For Leivik's left-wing Yiddish reader, a katego was a password. It admitted these non-Jewish Italian anarchists into Jewish collective memory in the context of a humanitarian Yiddish poem. I want to share with you another poem, this one by Esther Shumyacher, a Canadian Yiddish poet who spent the 1920s traveling the world with her spouse, the playwright Peretz Hirschbein. And I've included on this slide a copy of their passport. In the 1920s, you could have a passport with your spouse. I actually use this passport as the cover of my book. Shumyacher makes the process of recognition across groups explicit in her poems that she writes about East Asia. She spent 10 months in the Soviet Union following her travels. She had just been in East Asia and then in the Middle East. And she was living on a Jewish farming colony in Crimea, where she completed and also published in Soviet Yiddish journals several poems about the groups that she saw on her travels. And in one of them, she writes the following. I've sown my days in wanderings from the broad shores of the Yangtze to the Ganges. I have sought in dark eyes a familiar interpretation and recognize in those eyes the sound of the hammer and sickle. So the hammer and sickle here goes beyond the demands of the password. It's a heavy-handed party shibboleth, marking this poem as internationalist and likening the workers on the banks of the Yangtze and the Ganges to the Jews who were building farming colonies in the Soviet Union. But what I find really striking about this poem is the idea of recognition that she gets to in the last couple of lines here. Dark eyes, which she later uses to describe herself in the Soviet Union, mark the ethnic other in Asia. And when you read it in tandem with verse that she wrote about Russia, Shumyacher's poems of East Asia emerge as these innovative experiments in merging an exoticized other with an exoticized Jew. There's a lot to say about Shumiatra's unreconstructed exoticizing in the people that she writes about. On the one hand, we find, stereotype descriptions of geishas and of Muslim men, but then on the other, she performs the role of this exoticized Jewish self, and she did receive some critique for that, even among her contemporaries. Well, poems describing the struggles of Chinese workers, African Americans, Ukrainian peasants, Spanish anti-fascists, Crimean Roma, and others filled the pages of Soviet and Soviet-aligned Yiddish journals in the 1930s. On this slide, you see on your left the Freiheit. This was the communist daily newspaper, which had a very wide circulation in the tens of thousands in New York. It published from the 20s through the 1980s. In the middle, you see Der Hammer, which was an American Yiddish literary journal, and the illustration on the cover is by William Groper, the left-wing cartoonist, here depicting this snake of fascism. And on the far right, you see Die Rote Welt, which was a long-form literary publication that was published in Kharkiv. Kharkiv is now in Ukraine and was briefly the capital of Soviet Ukraine. And this is, the Rote Welt is where Shumiatra published a lot of her poems while she was living in the Soviet Union. The passage from collective Jewish suffering to other people's suffering was a response to several different things. The rise of fascism and also specific events around the world, the Shanghai massacre of communists in 1927, the Scottsboro trial that began in 1931. But it also was a direct response to Soviet views on nationality and nationhood that originated perhaps with Lenin's acknowledgement of the lasting strength of national difference. But this idea about the importance of nationhood became stronger during the third period of the Comintern, which began in 1928 with the Sixth Party Congress. And this period marked Stalin's declaration that socialists were social fascists, but it also included the consideration of colonized agrarian peoples to be workers. So the third period was an important moment for the recognition of different forms of struggling workers around the world. But there was more at stake for Jewish poets than party alignment or even empathy. The choice, I believe, to describe other nation struggles also affirmed and demonstrated Jews' successful modernization. Survivors of pogroms, the Soviet Jews, were now part of a nation-building effort. And then immigrants, East European Jewish immigrants to both North and South America, may still have faced anti-Semitism, but they nonetheless sometimes passed for members of a privileged white majority. Still, as recently as 1920, Henry Ford had published a translation of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is an anti-Semitic forgery. And in the 1930s, you had these opponents of the New Deal who were spreading rumors about Roosevelt's Jewish ties. So partly in response to these growing anti-Semitic outbursts, Jewish party-aligned writers were trying to make social justice an international issue and not only a Jewish one. Some of the most striking examples of passwords that I've encountered and passphrases came during the Scottsboro trial in the 1930s in the United States. Malka Lee, whose biography I've already introduced to you, uses the term Gott's schwarzer Lamm, God's black lamb, to liken the victim of a lynching to Jesus. And I'll read to you just this excerpt. They led him outside with bare feet and bound hands. His skin burnt by southern sand. His flesh became suddenly oily. His black body sparkled in tears. The woods bowed low as if cut by a knife. Go back, God's black lamb tore himself from the rope. Well, pogrom victims had been commonly cast as Jesus figures in Jewish modernist poetry and art. And I included here an image of one of Marc Chagall's first crucifixion images, which he painted in 1912, Golgotha. But Lee's poem was published in 1932, and this was early in the Scottsboro trial. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Scottsboro trial, in 1931, 9 young Black men, and I think the oldest was 19, were falsely accused of raping 2 white women on the roof of an Alabama freight train. They were all hoboing across the South, which was what people did in the 1930s. And the Scottsboro trial, which began in 1931 and lasted well over a decade. Some people cite the final date as 1950, but the last defendant to be completely exonerated, that didn't happen until the 2000s. This absorbed the American literary imagination in the 1930s, and it divided the American left. It also mobilized many Yiddish writers to describe the horrific racism that they were witnessing in their adopted country. This is an image, it's an often oft-used image of the Scottsboro defendants together with their lawyer, Samuel Leibowitz, who was Jewish, although he was not a party member. But Yiddish poets like Malka Lee, who wrote about Black Christ figures in the 1930s, were synthesizing during this Scottsboro trial crucifixion motifs from pogrom art and poetry with crucifixion motifs in English language poetry, especially by left-wing Black poets by Langston Hughes. And on this slide, you see again the Marc Chagall painting Golgotha. The image in the middle is Uri Tzvi Greenberg's poem, which he wrote in the shape of a cross, Uri Tzvi Before the Cross. Uri Tzvi Greenberg wrote a lot of poems about pogroms. He then emigrated to Palestine and shifted completely into writing in Hebrew. So his pogrom poems led to a nationalist direction rather than an internationalist one. And then on the right, you see Langston Hughes's chapbook, Scottsboro Limited, illustrated by Prentice Taylor here. And this included not only the play by the same title, but a couple of poems that used the image of the crucifixion to talk about the Scottsboro boys, Christ in Alabama, and also the poem Scottsboro. Well, Scottsboro, the Alabama town where the defendants were incarcerated, became a password in its own right for racial inequality in the United States. And a number of Yiddish poets titled works Scottsboro simply to signal their support of the Scottsboro defendants and the Comintern-sponsored international labor defense, but also to basically say there is a problem with race in America. And here's an example. This poem is titled Scottsboro. It's by a poet, Y.E. Ronch, who wrote extensively about African-American culture in Yiddish. And you might notice in this poem that he seems to be borrowing directly, perhaps even plagiarizing to some extent, from Richard Wright. He writes, "I've seen Black masses on their knees, ecstatic for Jesus the Savior, and glowing eyes, eternal gaze, and calloused hands stretched out in prayer." So this was published in 1936. And if we look at an excerpt from Richard Wright's poem, I Have Seen Black Hands, published in 1934 in the New Masses, we see a lot of similarities. Wright writes, "I am Black and I have seen black hands, millions and millions of them, reaching hesitantly out of days of slow death for the goods they have made, but the bosses warned that the goods were private and did not belong to them. I am Black and I have seen black hands raised in fists of revolt, side by side with the fists of white workers." So as I mentioned, there's a lot of reasons that leftist Yiddish writers turned their attention to others, and these differed depending on the contexts. In the US, these included political solidarity, empathy, and perhaps in Ronch's case here, even a kind of translation or artistic apprenticeship as a new American poet. But in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, the reasons for writing about others were beginning to shift. If in the 1920s, there had been an encouragement of friendship of nations that went side by side with a sense that there might still be some degree of cultural autonomy, this was changing by the 1930s. In the 30s, it was becoming increasingly dangerous to talk about one's own nationality. Talking about other groups was a way of talking about the importance of having a cultural identity at all. And David Hofstein, I devoted a chapter of my book to him as a case in point. What you see in front of you is a very short piece of a pogrom poem that he wrote titled Ukraine from 1922. It was included in his book Troyer, or Sadness, illustrated by Marc Chagall. And he writes in the second person, speaking to Ukraine. He writes about the fear of living in the Ukrainian countryside during the Civil War of 1918 to 1920. Where bandits' footsteps and drunken songs are at your swarming markets. He moved to Palestine for a year in the mid-1920s, but returned to the Soviet Union in 1926. And after he did this, he did fairly well for himself. He published until he was executed by Stalin in 1952. But he increasingly complained that he couldn't talk about cultural tradition anymore. And in the 1930s, he began translating, especially from Ukrainian, and sometimes writing about the suffering of Ukrainians and of Ukraine. So writing about other groups became a Trojan horse for writing about one's own group. Here is his second poem titled Ukraine, which was published in 1944. And this casts Ukraine as a child who's emerged from the violence, not only of the Civil War, but of the Nazi occupation. I'll just read this short excerpt. From smoke and from woe, from ash and from shame, I see you lift your wounded hand. Your head rises, pasted in blood. So Hofstein couldn't write anymore about specifically Jewish pain. So instead he was writing about collective Ukrainian pain. He had also spent a lot of time, as I mentioned, translating, and he was translating poems from especially the classical bard of Ukrainian Romanticism, Taras Shevchenko. I believe that what he was doing was using Ukrainian pain as a way of talking about the increasing strictures on Jewish culture. These internationalists force a constant confrontation within me between the cynic and the optimist. To what degree is writing about others always a kind of Trojan horse for writing about oneself, even if we aren't living under the repressive conditions of Stalinism? So when we talk about Jewish writers talking about others' experiences, what I think we're really talking about is something fundamental about human nature. We're asking, is it possible to know another's pain? Well, internationalism changed with World War II for these Yiddish writers. By the end of the 1930s, as I've mentioned, with the Hitler-Stalin Pact, many Jewish writers returned to Jewish topics. And yet there were these exceptions, and Aaron Kurtz was one of them. He remained with the party for the rest of his life. He wrote a birthday poem to Stalin in the late 1940s. But there were a number of Yiddish writers that did return to a poetics of internationalism in the civil rights era. And of course, in the 1960s, integration led to violence. And Aaron Kurtz, who had written a lot about race violence in the 1920s and 30s, dedicated a poem titled Kaddish to the 4 Black schoolgirls who were killed in a 1963 Alabama church bombing. I'll read just part of it. It's a fairly long poem. Yiskadal v'yiskadash, face to face with Abe Lincoln, face to face with the Negro martyred people. A rabbi says Kaddish. I am not a Kaddish sayer, but today mamas the world over bitterly wept and mourned the 4 little Black girls. I responded to the rabbi's Kaddish, Amen. So Kurtz here is using the Kaddish prayer. This is the prayer of the traditional prayer of mourning in Judaism to mourn multiple tragedies simultaneously. And I think he manages here to absorb the subjectivity of the mourner, as well as the implicated subject, to use Michael Rothberg's term. So I've conducted this research over the last several years as a means of understanding a very specific community of writers. These are Jewish poets who were aligned with the Communist Party. And I wrote it as a salvage literary history. But this concept of the password has emerged, and it has taken hold with me. And there's a couple of directions that I plan to go with my future work. First of all, I'm not done with these Yiddish poets. I'm continuing to think about them, to work on some of them. And part of my current work is exploring how mutual these relationships may have been. In some cases, like in Aaron Kurtz's, Kurtz was actually married to a Canadian Trinidadi poet of Spanish descent, and the 2 of them wrote about each other and translated each other. But one of the goals that I have for this year, as I've mentioned, is to see whether this idea of the poetic password is itself translatable to another group of poets. And my new project will take me to a group of poets and artists working today in Ukraine. Since the 2013-2014 protests in Kiev, known as the Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity, I've noticed that Ukrainian writers and artists have been writing a lot about Ukrainian identity as a shared identity, rather than talking about being Ukrainian on national terms, what does it mean to be ethnically Ukrainian, more and more writers are talking about this collective history of tragedies of multiple groups living in one space. It's a kind of civic turn in Ukrainian society. This has involved broadening a historical narrative to include the collective traumas of ethnic minorities in Ukraine. So for example, Ukrainian writers have been negotiating the relationship between Holocaust memory and the more specifically Ukrainian memories of the largely engineered famine under Stalin known as the Holodomor, or the Great Hunger in the early 1930s, and this killed millions of residents of Ukraine. Although many people in Ukraine see a discussion about the Holocaust as necessary, for others, this raises a specter of forced internationalism. It also raises this very painful issue of a small number of Ukrainians who collaborated with Nazis. So very recently, something that's been in the news has been the commemoration of Babyn Yar. Babyn Yar was a massacre that took place on Ukrainian soil in 1941. This was the largest massacre that happened anywhere in the Soviet territories during World War II. Over 2 days on the outskirts of Kiev, over 75,000 people were shot into a ravine. Most of them were Jews. It also included Roma, communists, and others. And over the next couple of years of Nazi occupation, that number doubled. Well, recently, a number of Ukrainians have been writing about Babyn Yar, and I've seen more writing about Babyn Yar than we see from the past. In 2017, the Ukrainian poet Mariana Kianovska wrote a book-length poem, Babyn Yar Holosami, or Babyn Yar Voices. Actually, a translation of this book will come out with Harvard University Press, I think any minute now. I'm very excited to see it and perhaps to teach it. But this is a long book, and it animates voices that are telling their stories, voices of the dead. In the passage that I've put on this slide, Kianovska is juxtaposing the irreconcilable memories of the Ukrainian famine of 1933 with the Babyn Yar massacre of 1941. I'll read this short excerpt. This place is like Babylon, except that here what's mixed up isn't languages, but silences and bones. Although some aren't mixed at all, me with my 33, you with your 41. Now in Ukrainian, Samistce nemov Вавилон, але тут у нас перемішано не мови, а мовчання і кості. Хоча деякі не перемішано я зі своїми з 33-го, ти зі своїми з 41-го. So 33, or 33rd in the Ukrainian, is a password for Ukrainian suffering. And by mentioning it, Kianovska is able to talk about Jewish loss on Ukrainian soil. The Ukrainian poet Serhiy Zhadan has praised Kianovska for this particular passage. He's noted that she subtly conveys that the two historical traumas are interconnected, intertwined, that they can't be separated from one another. He writes, the experience of death must be combined, not divided. So I'm eager as I get into this next project to look at the questions of representation from another angle, to ask in light of an ongoing political entanglement, when it's appropriate for experiences of death to be combined or whether they must be divided. I'll stop there and I'm eager to take your questions. Thanks so much.
Amelia, thank you so much. This was an incredibly fascinating talk and there are lots of questions, so let's get to them. The first one is about the password, so let me read it out to you. Can you talk about the connotation of the term password you're using? Clearly, it marks access from one group to another, but are you also evoking the notion of secret, which password usually connotes?
Yeah, it's exclusive passage. And of course, password is, I actually really wanted to title the book Passwords, and my really wonderful editor, Kathleen McDermott at Harvard University Press was like, no, it sounds like IT. It sounds like you're talking about, computer passwords. But passwords are secret and you have to share them. You can share them, of course, but you have to share them in order to allow for that crossing over. And of course, I'm not the first person to talk about this, this passage. Derrida talked about Paul Celan's use of communist shibboleths. And one of the things that Derrida writes that I find really useful is that it's not about the inability to speak, these passwords, these untranslatables that appear in his case, Paul Celan's poems aren't about the inability to speak, but they're about words that are repeated in lots of different ways over and over again. So they mark a poem and they kind of bring it over, they allow access. So yeah, I mean, they're not secret, they're published, they're poems, but it's special access. When Leivik is writing about Sacco and Vanzetti, they're kind of being converted to Judaism, right? They're being brought into the fold because now they're in a Yiddish poem and they have this word katego that brings them in. And the same happens, I believe, with the Scottsboro defendants and with these Chinese workers that Shumyatra writes about.
The next question asks, how does this analysis square with non-Jewish leftist European poets concerned with internationalism and racial violence abroad?
Yeah, so I'm writing about Yiddish poets, but they're very much in the context of writing in the context of the party. And I think they have more in common with non-Jewish internationalists and non-Jewish communists than they do with, let's say, non-communist or non-leftist, at least Yiddish writers. There are several figures that just keep coming up in my work who are not Jewish, but who are sort of part of this team. Langston Hughes appears in multiple chapters. His writing is sort of about the same people, the same topics at the same time. Vladimir Mayakovsky writing in Russia, and Marina Tsvetaeva are using very similar kinds of passwords when they write about other groups. And in fact, Scottsboro is a really interesting case in point. There's a lot of poetry about Scottsboro in Russian as well. And that's something that I didn't go into for the purposes of this study, but that that may be a really interesting direction for a future study. It's certainly going to be important for my study of Ukraine to think about the legacy of internationalism. And it's a much more mixed legacy there where there's a current confrontation with Russia.
The next question starts with, thank you for the fascinating talk, exclamation mark. So the question is, who was the intended audience for these poems? Can you address this paradox in their endeavor? They had universalist aspirations, and yet they wrote in a language that is only accessible to some.
Yeah, that's a really important question. Thank you for asking that. The audience was Jews, right? The intended audience was Yiddish-speaking Jews. They were writing for, and this may get back to the first really good question about passwords, right? Is it denying access? Is it secret? Yiddish was a language that was spoken almost exclusively by Jews, not entirely exclusively. You could learn it, but most people didn't. It wasn't a language you'd learn in school. So writers who were writing in Yiddish were really writing for their own families and communities, trying to convince them of something. And they had a lot of leeway. You could write whatever you wanted about, let's say, a worker in China, because she probably wasn't going to read the poem. And it was, therefore there wasn't the same kind of universal, I'm going to represent in this language that everybody speaks, this group. I noticed this in particular in the poems about Scottsboro, that these poems about Black Americans are being written, sometimes sort of just borrowed from Black American poetry and written for a Jewish audience. But, you have, often, really cringeworthy, exoticizing and so forth that the Yiddish poets didn't have to deal with or confront their subjects with, because they were writing for these other Jews. What I'd really like to know is what the relation is. This is something that I'm working on actually actively now, is what was the relationship between some of these communist Black writers and communist Yiddish writers. How many of the Black writers beyond, let's say, Paul Robeson, who's always the wonderful example, actually knew about the Yiddish poems that were being written. Robeson did. He spoke a little bit of Yiddish. He sang in Yiddish. He spent time with Yiddish writers in the Soviet Union. Other people like Langston Hughes also spoke some Russian and spent time in the Soviet Union, so there were connections there. But for the most part, these were not being written for English speakers. Right. And therefore, it changes the way that the subjects are being described.
So there's a question now that kind of joins the two questions earlier, which is the use of password and the Yiddish language. And they ask, Do you think there's something about the Yiddish language specifically, or other fusion languages, that lends itself to the use of passwords?
Thank you. Yes, I do. I think Yiddish is a language of passwords. And so of course it lends itself. And that's why, that's, I think, how I came to this framework through Yiddish poets. Although I now believe that the framework will hold for other languages as well. Yiddish is a language of passwords. It's a language of shibboleths. It's a language that contains lots of other languages. So as a fusion language, just to kind of translate that question, for others, Yiddish is of course a combination of a lot of different languages, Aramaic, Biblical Hebrew, European languages, obviously German, Middle High German. In this case, that was the time when Jews were residing in the Alsace region. But then of course, Yiddish, as Jews evolved and migrated through Europe, they picked up other languages, Czech and Ukrainian and Polish and so forth, and English eventually. And so it's a language full of these other languages. And within Yiddish, you have things like Ganovimsprach, which literally means thieves' language. And that would be a language that could be spoken by thieves to evade people that might know a more basic Yiddish, and often contained more Hebrew elements than Germanic elements. So Yiddish already contains these kind of elements of the password, which the meaning then attached to a given word, right? A very specific word that has a history, like kategel, which comes from the Greek, right? Through Hebrew, through biblical Hebrew into Yiddish. The history of the migration of this word ends up lending it that much more meaning as a password.
Yeah. The next question is about the post-war period, but we'll get to password in the end. So here, this one. How did World War II and the founding of Israel affect lefty Yiddish writers? That's the first question. Did any of them change their attitude towards Zionism or Hebrew or the conflict? And then finally, did any of them reuse their earlier password with new meanings?
Thank you. Wow, that's such a great final. I'm going to have to think. I have to just kind of set aside that final question because that's so interesting, and I want to think more about it. I'll answer the question about Zionism and World War II first. The easy answer is yes. I find it really striking. I was actually just talking with my colleague here at Harvard, Saul Zared, about this fact that you have all of these Yiddish writers becoming, if not Zionists, becoming friendly towards the idea of a state of Israel after World War II. And there's, there's a kind of obvious reason for that, that the World War II changed the way people thought about Jewish identity, and it pulled, it pulled Jewish thought inward. Anecdotally, the writers that I work on, including some of the Soviet writers, including Moshe Taif, who wrote this bastardized version of Bialik, about how horrible Zionism was in 1929, even he became somewhat sympathetic toward the state of Israel. So anecdotally, many of them are sort of thinking more about Israel as a possibility after World War II. Some of them are traveling there. And then there are others that remained very, very anti-Zionist throughout their entire lives, or traveled there and still remained anti-Zionist, so remained skeptical. But the general trend was the immediate wake of World War II, these leftist writers became friendlier toward the idea of a Jewish state. And that's something that deserves a lot more attention, that shift. It certainly deserves a study. The final question, can you repeat that final piece again, Claudia? Because that was
sure, absolutely.
Use of the passwords.
I repeat the last two. Did any of them change their attitude? I think you answered this one. Did any of them reuse their earlier passwords with new meanings?
I really love this question, and I need to think about it because passwords can change, right? Passwords can, of course, change meanings. And I think the question that that might be implied in my mind would be, I'd love to just go running back to Moshe Taif's collected works in the post-war years. He actually shifted to Russian after the war. Taif has a really horrible biography, by the way. He was imprisoned in the 30s in like 1937. Then he was let out of prison in the 40s and put straight on the front lines, and had to fight on the front lines as an artillery person. He lost his wife and son in the Minsk ghetto. He emerged from World War II only to be rearrested with the arrest of most of the Yiddish writers at the end of the 1940s. I'd love to go back to his work and see if he ever reused Bialik in a different way, because that would be the first place I would look and the first place I would expect to see that, a reassessment of what this meaning of trauma should mean and who it gets to be applied to. I don't have an immediate example at the top of my head, although I'm going to think about this because there may be some floating around.
Sure. The next question is, I'm curious to know what happened when Yiddish writers used Yiddish instead of Hebrew that carried different historical meaning, I guess, and passwords. For example, when you read Bialik Lech Leka poem, the phrase Lech Leka, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, is biblical and brings so many other memories, and is in Yiddish, this is lost.
Yeah, I mean, the Hebrew allows for much more fluid citation of biblical Hebrew sources, which means on the one hand that there might be a loss of some of those sources writing in the other, this other particular Jewish language that we're talking about. There are other Jewish languages out there. But in some cases, it also meant that the biblical Hebrew is more marked in Yiddish. It's almost underlined because there's a different spelling system. It comes from this different language pattern. So Yiddish as a fusion language does have the capacity to contain a lot of Hebrew words, and the ones that are important to mention can be brought in.
Right.
But you do see some translations. There's a just really quickly, there's a poem that I address elsewhere in the book by Aaron Kurtz about the Spanish Civil War called Kol Nidre, which is based on the opening prayer of Yom Kippur. And he opens it with a Yiddish translation of the Aramaic Kol Nidre prayer. He easily could have had, Kol Nidre at the beginning and then just said it in Aramaic, but he translates it into Yiddish because he wants his readers to think about the meaning in a new context.
The next question is, to what extent were these Jewish left-wing poets influenced by the activism of other Jewish in the left wing who took other causes and suffering as their own?
Other Jews in the left wing, right? So these particular poets that took up causes. I mean, this was the writers who were on the left, the writers who were affiliated with the party were very much part of a community. Their community was a community of left-wing activists. And so, there was a lot of discussion of, these key figures, not just Jewish figures. I'm trying to think of the perfect example of a Jewish activist. I'm so immersed in the world of these Yiddish language poets. But they certainly were writing about Angelo Herndon, who was, an important activist in the Scottsboro trial, was imprisoned. He had a number of Yiddish poems written about him. And so, yes, there were, if you were a major party activist in the 1920s and 30s, especially if you were Jewish, you would probably have a poem dedicated to you because these were sort of the heroes of this new community that was being constituted. And effectively what these writers were doing was redefining what it meant to be us, right? Is it we Jews, or is it we workers of the world, we communists? And so you needed your heroes, you needed your leaders.
I think we have time for one last question. Did the post-war Yiddish poets in North America has relationship with the Israeli Communist Party, especially in the 1950s?
That's a great question. And I'm not an expert in kind of this period, especially in sort of the international communist politics, Jewish communist politics of the post-war period. I really focused on that period leading up to that. And I should have an answer to your question. The Israeli Communist Party in the period that I'm talking about, especially in the 1920s and 30s, was actually known as I think it was the Communist Party of Palestine. And that was almost entirely Jews, but did include some Arabs as well. And I don't think there was much contact. I think there was aspirational contact. I think there was the idea that, we need to band together with these people, but there was such a firm rejection of the idea of Zionism among the writers that I'm talking about, that that wasn't necessarily their community, but I could be proved wrong. And many of these writers, when they started to become a bit more welcoming of the idea of a state of Israel, had their works translated into Hebrew, visited the state of Israel. And so at that point, I'm certain that the connections were probably made. It's a great question.
Right. Thank you, Amelia. Thank you for your thoughtful presentation and perspectives. I also want to thank you, the audience, for the terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for another Radcliffe virtual program. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.